The river that cleaves the old industrial town of Glassford begins as a trickle in the hills and widens patiently, unwilling to rush, the way some truths take a lifetime to declare themselves. Nor always thought of it when her mother recited, in a whisper that seemed stitched from wind, "O you who believe, seek help through patience and prayer. Surely God is with the steadfast." It was a phrase her mother had sewn into every silence of their apartment, an invisible embroidery that Noor stepped over as a child and carried like lint in her teenage pockets. On the late summer morning that begins this narrative, years after the twin plumes of smoke in New York had rewritten the geometry of suspicion, Noor drifted down Main Street past empty storefronts, a hijab the color of soldered steel framing a face too serious for 17. A history teacher once called Glassford the place America forgot to repaint, and the phrase hung over the town like sun-bleached bunting. Roofs sagged, paint blistered, yet rust had its own palette, and Noor loved the stubbornness of brick that never collapsed all at once. Inside the only remaining diner, news tickers muttered about troop deployments overseas. Noor's mother, Layla, waited tables there, accepting every tip with the same half-bow that reminded the regulars she had earned a PhD in pharmacology in Cairo before visas and wars rearranged her resume. On slow afternoons she practiced English idioms under her breath. Bite the bullet, off the top of my head, rain check. Not because customers cared, but because language, like faith, needed repetition. 2 weeks earlier, a stranger had left a folded napkin that read "Go home" in felt tip. Layla found it after the man left. She smoothed it flat, slid it beside the register, and quietly traced the letters until the loops in the G and O resembled chains she refused to wear. Then she tore the napkin into 33 squares, whispering the opening line of Surah 2, 153 with each tear, turning insult into confetti. Noor understood none of this when the story of patience first engraved itself on her heart. She was 9, her father still alive, the family still whole. He had bought milk at dawn, his winter coat smelling of saffron from the bakery's sweet rolls. At breakfast he recited the verse in Arabic and English, testing Noor's memory. "Be steadfast in adversity," he instructed, tapping the table as if it were a Quranic board. 2 hours later, a factory conveyor belt that had outlived its warranty snapped, and his name was absorbed into the clamor of accident reports. At the cemetery, the imam reminded mourners that God calls the patient blessed, that those who fall in his cause are not truly dead. The words made sense grammatically. They mutilated sense emotionally. Noor decided patience was a synonym for numbness. She would revise that definition again and again. The day she received her college acceptance letter, an envelope so thin she feared rejection until she unfolded the single sheet, Noor walked the river's length, rehearsing a vow. For years away, she would return here only as a visitor. Layla listened that night, tea cooling between them, and answered with a smile both proud and frightened. "You may travel the world," she said, "but verses travel inside you." She pressed her palm against Noor's sternum. "The page is closer than your pulse." Orientation week at Dyer State University smelled of cut grass and pre-med ambition. Dormitory halls thrummed with introductions. Names traded like currency, identities stitched temporarily to hoodies. Noor discovered that when classmates asked where she was from, the question was a Russian doll. Glassford was not enough. Her parents' immigration, her religion, the perceived distance between their cafeteria and what the evening news called the Muslim world, all rattled inside the polite question. She tried to answer with humor. From a Pennsylvanian galaxy far, far away. Sometimes it worked. On Friday, as students clustered on the quad to map weekend possibilities, a blonde sophomore unfolded a collapsible table and taped a poster. "Meet a Muslim. Free Q&A." His name was Daniel Price, a comparative religion major who claimed curiosity was oxygen. Noor paused at the fringe, amused and indignant. 10 minutes later, she found herself sitting opposite him beneath a sycamore, defending the word jihad like an overworked lawyer. Daniel listened, really listened, without inserting himself, then asked if she'd ever visited Philadelphia's Islamic art exhibit. She had not. He scribbled gallery hours on a napkin and said he'd drive if she brought playlists. The proposition was half awkward, half kind, and Noor surprised herself by agreeing. Their friendship developed the way calligraphy unrolls on parchment, each flourish inviting another. They studied in the same library corner, swapped annotated copies of Baldwin and Morrison, argued whether Salinger's Holden Caulfield deserved the perpetual syllabus. When Daniel announced he'd enrolled in Arabic 101, Noor warned him the glottal stop might assassinate his throat. He laughed, coughed, and tried anyway. For months he could recite Surah 1 with only 2 mispronunciations. On cold evenings they walked to the campus chapel because its organ rehearsals filled the rafters like migrating geese. Noor wondered if sharing that echo blurred boundaries of faith, but each time she inhaled the varnished wood scent, she felt closer, not further, from her own tradition, as though patience included learning harmony in another key. Political air thickened. A cartoon published in a European magazine caricatured the prophet. Protests bloomed internationally. In town, a brick shattered the halal butcher's window. Noor joined a campus teach-in, quoting Quranic verses advocating mercy. Daniel filmed the event, posted clips online, and found his inbox riddled with threats labeling him a sympathizer. He printed one email, framed it, and titled The Peace Portrait of Ignorance for an art class project. The professor awarded an A, but the university police suggested he vary his walking route. Through every wave of menace, Surah 2's promise, God is with the patient, throbbed in Noor's mind like a drum beaten off stage, directing unseen dancers. Midway through junior year, Daniel applied for an NGO internship in Gaza, tasked with installing solar panels at clinics. The application essay opened, "I believe patience is applied hope." He credited Noor for the phrasing. When the acceptance email arrived, relief and dread braided themselves in her throat. Layla advised, "When God says do not say of those slain in his cause that they are dead, he is expanding the definition of life. But he does not say we must like the expansion." To Daniel, Noor gave a notebook embossed with silver filigree and the word Sabr, Arabic for patience. "Fill it honestly," she instructed. He promised to return by Ramadan. Emails arrived hourly, then daily, then once a week. First he wrote about children drawing solar-powered dreams, then about drone hum at night, then about a silence so thick it glued windows shut. Noor refreshed her inbox until the letter O rubbed off her keyboard. One dawn the news reported an airstrike on a refugee corridor. Layla turned off the television before Noor entered the kitchen. But grief is a scent before it is a fact. Noor smelled it clinging to the curtains. 2 days later, the NGO sent a terse message. Daniel Price is presumed dead. Official confirmation pending. Time folded. Condolence cards blurred into a single gray syllable. Noor's professors offered extensions, but writing seemed treasonous to memory. She returned to Glassford, slept in her childhood room where wallpaper peeled like abandoned bandages. At the diner, Layla brewed extra-strong coffee, whispering the verse about those slain yet living. Her voice a bridge trying to reach the opposite bank. Noor wanted to burn that bridge. Grief produced paradoxes. She prayed more, resented prayer more, clung to patience like wreckage, despised being told to wait. Morning after morning she walked the river until freeze-thaw cycles sculpted ice into mirrors. In one reflection she saw Daniel alive, waving. In the next he dissolved into current. She memorized Surah 2, 155 against her will. "We shall surely test you with fear and hunger and loss of wealth and lives and fruits, but give good tidings to the patient." Yet she recited it anyway, wondering if obedience absent enthusiasm still counted. Slowly, recitation became breathing, unchosen yet essential. Winter surrendered. Spring arrived with lilac breezes and a letter addressed in Daniel's handwriting, postmarked Cairo. It explained. During the evacuation he had shepherded toddlers onto an ambulance. The convoy was misreported destroyed. Communication lines fractured. He had spent months recovering in a Sinai clinic. He would be discharged in June. Noor reread the paragraphs until each crease in the paper resembled a timeline of alternate histories. Revival is its own trial. Patience has a sequel named Gratitude, and gratitude lacks the adrenaline of crisis. Noor returned to campus to finish her degree. She and Daniel agreed to meet at Philadelphia's 30th Street station on the first morning of Ramadan. The station's architecture, all arched ceilings and marble regret, seemed designed for reunions larger than language. When Daniel limped through the doors, one foot still learning its duties, nor felt the verse about the living dead rearrange her vocabulary. He was not a ghost. He was evidence that stories outrun statistics. They rented a small apartment near the Delaware River, its windows admitting both sunrise and traffic noise. Within weeks they discovered that proximity, after myth-making distance, required fresh patience. Dividing chores, negotiating thermostat wars, translating dreams into comprehensible sentences. Daniel converted to Islam quietly, no YouTube spectacle, just a testimony whispered at dawn beside Noor. There is no God but God. He insisted faith be an invitation, not a conclusion. Together they joined a coalition pushing for clean water in underserved Pennsylvania towns. At council meetings, Noor quoted the Qur'an's insistence that corruption on earth betrays divine trust. Daniel projected slides of solar desalination units. Proposals stalled, resurrected, stalled again. One night, after another bureaucratic postponement, Noor slammed their apartment door hard enough to rattle picture frames. Daniel waited, then placed Layla's torn napkin confetti. He had saved 2 squares, in her palm. She laughed through tears, understanding. Patience is sometimes shredded paper waiting to be remade into something celebratory. Years layered themselves like sediment. Noor taught high school literature back in Glassford, inviting students to read Baldwin alongside the Qur'an, mining both for verbs of resistance. Daniel established a non-profit distributing portable solar chargers to communities hit by hurricanes. At fundraisers he quoted Surah 156. To God we belong and to Him we return, pairing the line with a photo of streets glittering after a storm, resilience reflecting starlight. One July evening, as cicadas orchestrated dusk, Layla phoned. "You know how the verse ends?" she asked without preamble. "Upon those are blessings and mercy from their Lord, and it is they who are rightly guided." Noor replied that she did, though guidance sometimes felt like walking a tightrope blindfolded. Layla laughed softly. "The blindfold is not over your eyes," she said. "It is over the future. Your patience is how you walk anyway." In the pre-dawn hush of another Ramadan, Noor stood on her apartment balcony, the river far below murmuring old confidences. She inhaled air tasting of cardamom and dawn. Inside, Daniel prepared suhoor, humming an out-of-tune hymn. The world's news remained unresolved. Wars flickered, markets quaked, prejudices respawned like invasive vines. But patience was no longer a passive shield. It was active, tensile, the discipline of walking toward repair even when repair seemed a mirage. She recalled the promise etched into the opening verse of the story her father had loved. "Surely God is with the steadfast." The sentence no longer sounded like distant thunder. It pulsed behind her ribs with the steadiness of blood. She closed her eyes. Wind lifted branches, water lapped stone, and the first call to prayer unfurled across the sky, a banner announcing that night itself had been patient enough to step aside. Noor's first year of teaching unspooled like thread from a bobbin, steady until suddenly tangled. September's bright promises dulled into November's fluorescent fatigue, and lesson plans she'd crafted with missionary fervor sometimes collapsed under the weight of teenage disinterest. Yet on certain afternoons, when sunlight angled through cracked windows and dust motes floated like punctuation, she felt a hush descend, a hush that belonged to libraries, to mosques just before the first takbir. In those moments her students listened, really listened, to Langston Hughes asking what happens to a dream deferred, or to Toni Morrison explaining that definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. Noor punctured silence only to tie those lines to Surah 2. "Do not lose hope, nor be sad," she'd say, translating verse 154 into a vernacular hearts understood. If a hand rose to challenge her, "But Ms. Hassan, that's religion, and school's supposed to be neutral," she nodded thoughtfully, then answered that a text is neutral only until someone bleeds on it. Bleeding was what Deshaun Mitchell did in late January, figuratively first, then literally. He was a lanky junior whose hoodie sagged with unspoken stories. One Friday he stayed after class long enough for the hallway noise to fade. "Ms. Hassan," he began, "how long does patience last?" The question hung between them, raw and unsharpened. She asked what prompted it. He shrugged, eyes fixed on the graffiti carved into his desk. Truth hurts. Over the weekend, a bodega argument escalated. Deshaun intercepted a punch meant for his cousin, and a shattered beer bottle opened his cheek. 20 stitches traced a comet from ear to chin, and Patience suddenly had a clock attached to it, ticking audibly every time he looked in the mirror. Nor visited him at County General, bringing Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk and a small card bearing Surah 2:155 in looping calligraphy. She read the verse aloud until his eyelids drooped. As she left, he asked her to recite it once more, slower this time, so it sticks like glue. Outside the hospital, February wind howled down alleys like a prosecutor rehearsing closing arguments. Nor pulled her scarf tighter, tasting metal in the air, remembering her own adolescent conclusion that patience equaled numbness. She corrected herself. Numbness was anesthesia, patience was recovery without morphine. The latter hurt more but healed deeper. At home, Daniel monitored hurricane forecasts on 3 different tabs. A Category 4 brewed in the Gulf, headed for coastal Louisiana, where his nonprofit had installed half the town's solar chargers. He toggled between radar loops and spreadsheets, muttering contingencies. Nor set her bag down, pressed a kiss to the side of his neck. His stubble scratched like coarse prayer beads. "You smell like hospital disinfectant," he murmured. "And Psalms," she retorted, grinning when he rolled his eyes, an old joke, since he teased that the Qur'an's cadences sometimes echoed the ancient Hebrew songs he'd studied. They spent the next hour braiding their separate anxieties into one placid conversation about dinner, because marriage occasionally required disguises more elaborate than masquerade balls. The storm made landfall on a Tuesday evening, tearing roofs as if unsealing envelopes. Power toppled, cell towers bent, levees wept. For 48 hours Daniel's team reached no one, nor watched him pace their living room, laptop open like a wound. At dawn on the 3rd day, a message pinged, all volunteers accounted for, but several neighborhoods submerged, solar arrays mostly intact yet unreachable. Daniel exhaled a sound halfway between sob and shout. He typed relentless instructions, coordinating boat deliveries of battery packs. Nor brewed coffee strong enough to jolt remorse, then recited silently, "Indeed God is with the patient," unsure whether she meant him, the flooded families, or herself. Later that month, the Glassford School Board announced budget cuts threatening every arts elective. Literature, administrators argued, was not a tested subject and thus expendable. Nor joined a ragtag coalition of teachers, parents, and one determined custodian to fight the measure. They drafted petitions, held bake sales where cupcakes wore frosting slogans, "Keep Poetry Alive," and floodlit the issue on local radio. At the first town hall confrontation, Nor stepped to the microphone, heart thrumming so loudly she feared feedback. She spoke of empathy as infrastructure, of novels as flashlights that outlast batteries. She cited verse 157, "Upon the patient are blessings and mercy," then translated the sentence into policy. "Show mercy to children by funding the words that will one day talk them off ledges." Applause burst like breaking glass. The board delayed the vote. Delay is a cousin of patience, but not identical. Delay can decay into avoidance. Weeks stretched. Lobbying grew fierce. Corporate sponsors dangled technology grants contingent on instructional time efficiency. Nor's coalition wobbled. One parent switched sides after being promised an internship program for his senior son. Employers always use tomorrow to ransom today. On the eve of the revised vote, Daniel printed handbills quoting Maya Angelou and Surah Al-Baqarah side by side, then stapled them to telephone poles until frost nipped his fingers numb. Nor graded essays past midnight, each red mark shaped like an artery. The board's decision arrived in a single sentence: all non-core humanities courses are suspended pending fiscal stabilization. Patience that night tasted like rust. Nor unlocked her classroom one last time, stood amid desks arranged like abandoned pews, and imagined Deshaun walking in next semester, scar healed but story unheard. She packed posters, copies of The Bluest Eye softened by teenage sweat, and her father's wooden Qur'an stand. When she closed the door, she quoted verse 156 aloud, voice steady, "Indeed we belong to God, and to Him we return." The hallway swallowed the words, leaving only the echo of rubber soles retreating. Unemployment lasted 41 days, long enough for doubt to unpack suitcases. Nor applied to charter schools, community colleges, even an online tutoring startup that paid per click. Interviews grew repetitive. "We value multicultural literacy," hiring panels assured her, then asked if she could trim mentions of religion to avoid parent pushback. She smiled, answered diplomatically, and walked away each time feeling she'd bartered organs for rent money. At home, Daniel suggested relocating. His nonprofit had an opening in Houston. Noor pictured packing again, pictured Layla alone in Glassford where the diner now served microwaved meals because the cook quit for a warehouse gig. Patience, she realized, is geographical, uprooting it too often risks snapping the stem. One cold March morning, mail delivered an envelope bearing the seal of Oxford's Centre for Interfaith Dialogue. Noor had applied months earlier on a dare just to see, she told Daniel when downloading the form. The letter offered a 2-year fellowship to develop curricula blending sacred texts with contemporary social justice literature. She read the paragraph twice before it combusted into exclamation. Yet beneath elation coiled fear, London skies, new classrooms, being the only hijabi in certain academic rooms, Layla's aging knees navigating TSA lines if she visited. Opportunity, like verse, required recitation into action. That night they gathered in Layla's living room, steam rising from lentil soup. Noor slid the acceptance letter across the table. Layla traced the crest, eyes bright. Kalam, she whispered, the Arabic word for pen has the same root as taklim, to prune. Writing shapes by removing. She paused, spoon poised. Oxford will prune you and Daniel. Are you ready for that? Noor hesitated. Daniel answered first. Pruning hurts, he said, but dead branches steal sunlight. Layla nodded, content with metaphor's verdict. Spring reassembled itself hastily. Daniel handed his non-profit to a deputy and negotiated satellite involvement from England. Noor drafted lesson sequences with meticulous joy, weaving Quranic verses through Morrison, Hughes, Sherman Alexie, Audre Lorde, until the syllabus resembled stained glass catching multiple suns. Visa applications, apartment searches near the Thames, and farewell dinners crowded the calendar. Deshaun visited, scar glowing faintly. He thanked Noor for the book she gifted him, said he'd decided to attend community college for journalism. Stories change stuff, he declared, tugging at his hoodie as if loosening gravity. She pressed Surah 2:157 into his palm on a slip of paper. Carry it, she advised, like a compass that points inward. Their flight lifted from Newark under a pink-gold dawn. As engines roared, Noor recited the traveler's prayer, palms cupped. Beside her, Daniel mouthed English approximations. 38,000 feet above the Atlantic, turbulence rattled plastic cups, a child cried, seatbelt signs blinked Morse code urgency. Noor closed her eyes, recalled the Glassford River refusing to rush, and thought turbulence is impatience made visible. She breathed until the shaking subsided, until engines hummed a lullaby key to Surah 2's promise. London smelled of whetstone and curry stalls. Their flat overlooked a narrow street where bicycles outnumbered cars. Jet lag, warp time, nights dissolved into scholarly dawns. At the center, Noor met colleagues, a Jewish poet from Brooklyn, a Sikh sociologist from Nairobi, an agnostic classicist whose Latin tattoos quoted Virgil. Debates bloomed like anemones. Does sacredness require authorship claims? Can literature secularize holiness without theft? Noor found herself defending the Qur'an's rhetorical repetitions as intentional music, not redundancy. When someone scoffed that patience was medieval passivity, she countered with the Prophet's migration as active endurance, a strategy not surrender. Mid-semester, Oxford Union hosted a panel on faith and the refugee crisis. Protesters gathered outside, some brandishing signs equating migrants with parasites. Police formed cordons. Inside the hall, Noor sat on stage beside an archbishop and a Syrian novelist. When her turn came, she described Layla shredding a hateful napkin into confetti, argued that patience is not victimhood but the decision to repurpose injury into compost for future roses. She quoted verse 155, her voice firm. Boos erupted from a cluster in the balcony, applause drowned them. Afterward, a young woman in a headscarf approached, eyes glossy. She had fled Aleppo, she said, and been told patience meant silence. Noor smiled gently. Silence is one dialect, she replied. But patience also speaks protest. Outside, evening dampness pasted flyers to lampposts. Daniel waited by the gate, umbrella tilted. They walked along cobblestones slick as memory. How many times, he wondered, has that verse rescued someone tonight? Noor considered. As many as there are hearts, she said, +1. Rain quickened, they ran, laughing, toward a bus stop glowing like a verse illuminated on vellum. Weeks later, a letter arrived from Glassford. Layla's diner was closing. Developers planned luxury condos. Gentrification wore progress like borrowed clothing. Noor read the news twice, pulse drumming grief. She drafted emails, sought media coverage, but transatlantic outrage skimmed along the ocean's surface and sank. Layla, pragmatic, began selling cookware on eBay, laughing about retirement. Yet at midnight Noor lay awake, picturing her mother's bow when accepting tips, a gesture now homeless. The fellowship's second year approached. Daniel proposed a summer visit home to help Layla transition. Noor agreed. But 2 days before their flight, London's transit screens flashed breaking news: a bombing at St. Pancras. Casualties mounting, investigation ongoing. Shock bleached the city. Noor's campus locked down, lectures suspended. Police sirens stitched a relentless quilt of panic. At home they tracked updates, motive unclear, suspects unnamed, but tabloids unleashed speculative venom toward Muslims. Daniel double-checked locks, Noor fielded condolence texts framed as suspicion. Patience, she realized, sometimes meant absorbing collective accusation without dissolving into apology. Their flight proceeded under heightened security. At JFK Customs, an officer scrutinized Daniel's passport conversion notation, religion, Islam, then detained him for secondary questioning. Noor waited in a plastic chair under fluorescent indifference, repeating verse 153 like a sorcerer looping incantations. 2 hours later Daniel emerged, shoulders tight but eyes calm. Questions about charity finances, he muttered. They missed the connection to Pittsburgh and spent the night in an airport hotel where carpets smelled of chlorine and lost ambition. At 3 a.m. Noor sat by the window watching freight trucks on the freeway. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Patience is faith wrestling inertia, pinning it just long enough for dawn to count as victory." Glassford greeted them with cicada song and construction cranes. The diner's sign already removed, only screw holes remained like punctuation marks ending a sentence no one finished. Layla hugged them fiercely, served dinner on mismatched plates, confessed relief at no longer balancing trays on aching wrists. She spoke plans, perhaps a home bakery, perhaps tutoring Arabic pronunciation at the mosque. Noor listened, hearing beneath the optimism a tremor, a mourning for the routine that had disguised loneliness. That night, as thunder escorted heat away, Noor proposed moving Layla to Oxford. Layla declined with a smile. Roots don't fear rain, they fear pots too small. Summer bled into amber. Daniel joined relief efforts after Midwest floods. Noor remained, cataloging the diner's unsold items. She found the register's drawer taped with 2 napkin squares bearing the faint G and O, the remnants of hate transfigured. She framed them behind glass, hung them in Layla's kitchen where dawn light would strike first. One morning, while sipping tea, Layla touched the frame and whispered the verses closing, and they are the guided. Noor realized guidance was not a destination but perpetual motion, like rivers refusing stasis. On their final evening before returning to England, Noor walked the riverbank alone. Fireflies wrote cursive on air. She heard distant train horns, imagined journeys stacking upon journeys. Pulling her phone, she opened a draft syllabus for the coming term, a unit on patience across scriptures, Job's lament, Buddhist mindfulness, Quranic Sabr. She added a line from Deshawn's essay, Stories Change Stuff, then saved the file. Wind lifted, carrying factory soot and honeysuckle. Noor recited Surah 2:153 aloud, not as plea or argument but as acknowledgement, the way one names constellations knowing they burn regardless of witness. The verse hovered, mingled with insects' hum, and settled against her skin like prophecy choosing a translator. She smiled, a quiet upward curve, half question, half answer, and began walking home, trusting the darkness to practice patience until morning rehearsed its predictable miracle. The plane that carried Noor and Daniel back across the Atlantic felt like a time-lapse capsule. Newark's summer humidity dissolved into Heathrow's drizzly September before they could finish a single in-flight movie. By the hour they reached Oxford, the cobblestones glimmered midnight black and the Radcliffe camera rose from the damp like a watchful moon. In their flat on St. John's Street the radiators clicked, malingering from last winter, but their suitcases exhaled Glassford heat, sugar dust from Layla's date cakes, cicada husks, the perfume of rusted river rails. They unpacked in silence sweeter than conversation, each garment folded a tiny vote that this life, the transoceanic, bilingual, calendared to the minute life, still fit. Morning announced itself with cathedral bells thick as bronze honey. Noor bicycled through narrow lanes where bicycles outnumbered regrets. Daniel, laptop balanced under one arm, peeled off toward the Center for Global Solar Equity on Banbury Road. Leaves already burnished by early frost swirled like confetti from last night's forgotten parade. If part of Noor's soul fretted about Layla pacing an empty diner kitchen half a world away, she buried the fret under pedal rhythm and Surah 2:153 murmured for the 1,000th time. Seek help through patience and prayer. The verse felt less like instruction now and more like pulse, systole sabr, diastole due. Her fellowship's second year began with a colloquium titled Curriculum as Sacred Technology. 12 scholars, 6 faith traditions, 1 rule, no jargon without metaphor. Noor presented first, unscrolling a lesson sequence that braided Surah Maryam with Morrison's beloved 2 texts about mothers whose love rewrites death. She showed slides, side-by-side Arabic calligraphy and Toni Morrison's handwriting, both curves daring the reader to slow down. When she finished, the Sikh sociologist applauded so hard his Kara bracelet clanged the table, the classicist blinked as though seeing new color. But a visiting columnist from a London broadsheet leaned back, steepled fingers, and asked whether pairing scripture with fiction trivialized divine revelation. The room inhaled. Noor answered with quiet steel, revelation is not glass. It doesn't shatter when juxtaposed. She quoted the Quranic refrain that God sets forth parables so people may reflect, then cited Prophet Muhammad listening to pre-Islamic poetry and praising its just lines. Reflection, she concluded, was the oldest form of worship. The columnist scribbled something, perhaps a barb, perhaps a concession, but offered no rebuttal. Outside, protesters still scarred the gates of St. Pancras, leaving wilted bouquets and conspiracy flyers accusing migrants of orchestrating the bombing. Noor deleted hate mail daily. Meanwhile, Daniel's inbox brimmed with pleas from Louisiana, Mozambique, Bangladesh, coastlines where storms were frequent visitors that never learned manners. His nonprofit's budget thinned like the ozone layer, donors fatigued by catastrophe's endless sequel. At night he lay awake calculating exchange rates and cargo costs, turning spreadsheets into origami cranes of hope. Noor watched the ceiling shadows flap and tried not to count the hours of sleep debt accruing interest between them. November delivered its test without warning. Daniel, inspecting a flooded clinic outside Khulna, Bangladesh, waded through brackish water laced with sewage. 3 days later, he staggered off a return flight burning with fever. The hospital confirmed leptospirosis, treatable but stubborn. Antibiotics skirmished in his bloodstream, fatigue colonized everything. Noor set up a sickbed in the living room, taping Psalm 23 on one wall, Surah Ash-Shar on the other, with hardship comes ease echoing, though I walk through the valley. She read them alternately while spooning rehydration salts past his cracked lips. Some nights he rambled in dream speech, half Arabic vocabulary, half engineering blueprints, ending invariably with, "Is the solar array above water yet?" Noor answered yes, even when she wasn't sure. During week 2 of his convalescence, a notification chimed. The same columnist who had questioned her now published an op-ed titled "The Silent Radicalism of Scripture in British Classrooms." He described Noor's curriculum without naming her, warning that students were being seduced into soft theocracy. Social media thugs amplified the piece. Trolls excavated an old photo of Noor in hijab beside a Black Lives Matter sign and declared her proof of an Islamic Marxist cabal. Emails sluiced in, subject lines dripping venom. University security offered patrols. Noor declined, quoting Malcolm X, "If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed." Instead, she printed the article, highlighted each misrepresentation, and crafted a line-by-line rebuttal grounded in verse and pedagogy. Publishing it, she knew, would multiply scrutiny, but patience was sometimes litigation in the court of truth. Meanwhile, Layla phoned from Glassford, sounding breathless. She'd slipped on ice outside the post office. Doctors suspected a hairline hip fracture. "Nothing I can't outpray," she joked, but Noor heard morphine under the humor. Flights were booked. Daniel insisted she go, illness be damned. When Noor protested, he smiled wanly. "Patience is teamwork, remember?" and pressed his tablet of medication schedule into her hand like a baton. She kissed his forehead, chilled by the fever's retreat but wary of its return, then flew west under skies bruised mauve. Glassford greeted her with icicles like stalactites hanging from traffic lights. In the hospital, Layla lay regal, hijab replaced by a knit cap embroidered with daisies. "Our bodies," she mused, "are impatient houses. They always need repairs." Noor sat bedside, reading from Surah Luqman about gratitude to parents until Layla drifted into analgesic sleep. Outside, the river crawled under thin ice, practicing endurance. Noor imagined it singing verse 2:155, "We shall surely test you with each slow current." The test deepened. Insurance paperwork revealed Layla's policy lapsed after the diner closed. Rehabilitation costs ballooned. Noor considered crowdfunding but feared hate comments overshadowing donations. She calculated savings, fellowship stipend modest, Daniel's nonprofit in drought, and felt numbers bleed red. That night she opened the Qur'an at random, her thumb landed on 2:177. "It is not righteousness to turn your faces to the east or the west, but righteousness is to give wealth, out of love for him, to kin, orphans, the needy." She closed the book, understanding the verse had issued marching orders. She emailed her program head requesting early release of next quarter's stipend, then sold her vintage bicycle online, a necessary amputation. Weeks melted together, hospital corridors, physical therapy gyms, insurance hotlines playing Vivaldi as if Baroque music could anesthetize panic. Yet through the grind small mercies sprouted. Deshawn mailed a handwritten article he'd published in the community college newspaper, Confetti Against Hate, One Woman's Diner Revolution, complete with a photo of Layla's framed napkin squares. The story went minor viral, attracting a local philanthropist who offered to cover half her rehab bill in exchange for permission to display the napkin image in a traveling exhibit on resilience. Layla laughed so hard she triggered the pain pump alarm. In late March, Daniel called, voice steadier, fever finally vanquished. He reported donors re-energized by a viral video of Bangladeshi villagers charging emergency lamps under sun-scarred panels, a light he'd helped raise. Noor listened, tears cooling her cheeks, realizing they were harvesting fruits from seeds once drowned. Surah 2:155 had promised loss of fruits as trial, recovery, then was God returning the orchard. By April, Layla graduated from Walker to Kane. Noor wheeled her through the old diner block where luxury condos now sprouted steel skeletons. Construction fences bore a developer's slogan, "Live the riverfront dream." Layla tapped the sign with her cane. Dreams, she sighed, forget who dreamt them first. But her eyes twinkled, she outlined a plan to rent a stall at the farmer's market, selling spice-infused pastries named after Quranic chapters, mac and cardamom crescents, Medinan pecan mammal. Each cookie a verse, she quipped. Noor promised website design and marketing. Yet Oxford's calendar beckoned, her fellowship review panel met in 6 weeks. Parting this time sliced deeper than airports could measure. Back in England, spring flared riotous, wisteria draped college walls like lavender graffiti. Daniel met her at the coach stop, healthier yet lean, cheeks carved by the fever's tax. He lifted her suitcase though his joints still protested. In their flat tulips she'd left to die stood resurrected, he'd coaxed them with YouTube tutorials and Qur'an recitations, uncertain which worked. Sabr, tulip, he'd whispered during their dormant phase. Bloom when ready. They had listened. The university scheduled her rebuttal essay against the columnist's op-ed for public debate. Friends advised withdrawing, why feed trolls, but Noor believed patience owed courage a stage. On the evening of the debate, Sheldonian theater thrummed. The columnist repeated claims, sacred text integration equals indoctrination, multi-faith curricula ferment division. Noor stepped to the lectern, palms damp but gaze steady. She opened not with defense but confession, I used to equate patience with numbness. She told the audience about her father's factory accident, about Daniel's fever, Layla's cane. Each episode, she said, taught her that Sabr is active, the art of choosing construction when demolition seems easier. She quoted Surah 2:157, upon the patient are blessings and mercy, then read emails from students who'd used her course to bridge families of differing faiths. If that is seduction, she concluded, then let knowledge be tempting. The hall erupted, the columnist nodded, lips thin, perhaps conceding or merely exhausted. Victories, however, seldom travel unattended. A week later Noor discovered she was pregnant, test strip faint but undeniable. Joy detonated, followed by dread, fellowship deadlines, finances, transatlantic grandmothers, Daniel's health. She tucked the strip into a leather notebook beside verse 2:286, God does not burden a soul beyond what it can bear, and decided to trust physiology's arithmetic. Daniel kissed the spot just above her navel, whispered both Shaida and Shakespeare, promising the child a library before a nursery. The first trimester unfurled like silk. Lectures delivered, grants secured to adapt her curriculum for online platforms, Layla's pastry venture netting modest profit. On a fog-damp morning in July, Noor heard the baby's heartbeat clop gallop like hooves on marble through a Doppler monitor. She wept, undone by the proof of unseen verses becoming flesh. But August brought bleeding, sudden and bright. Hospital corridors blurred into déjà vu, ultrasound silence screamed. The doctor's voice gentle, no fetal pole, a spontaneous miscarriage. The word spontaneous felt cruel, implying when she had prayed schedule. Daniel held her while she bled what might have been poems. After discharge, she sat on their balcony wrapped in a blanket that still smelled of hospital disinfectant. Rain drizzled fine as needle pricks. She opened the Qur'an to Surah Al-Hadid but words swam. Finally she spoke without reading, God promised tests with loss of lives and fruits. Daniel knelt, face blotched from shared grief. And he promised blessings on the patient, he rasped. Right now, she answered, blessing feels like wind on a wound. Silence nested. They stayed until rain stopped, until neighborhood church bells mistold the hour. Days crawled. Noor taught summer seminars, voice steady but eyes glazed. Students noticed tenderness in her pauses. Some wrote anonymous notes thanking her for modeling vulnerability. One evening she returned to find Daniel studying chapter 2 in Arabic. He pointed to verse 154, "Do not say of those slain in God's cause that they are dead." Maybe, he offered, our child claimed life in another dimension we can't audit. Theologians might quibble, but the hypothesis unaudted something inside her. She imagined a room in paradise wallpapered with unsung lullabies, where lost infants rocked in mercy's cradle. She whispered Bismillah and repurposed grief into prayer for all parents who never met their children. September arrived clothed in second chances. Noor's fellowship culminated with a public exhibit, Threads of Patience, featuring student art inspired by Surah 2 and civil rights literature. One canvas showed Layla's napkin fragments swirling into a dove, another depicted Daniel knee-deep in floodwater holding a solar panel like a gleaming shield. Visitors pinned paper leaves onto a sculpted tree, each leaf inscribed with a personal trial and a verse that steadied them. By closing night, branches sagged under testimony, cancer remissions, deportation appeals, divorce recoveries. Nor read every leaf. Common lexical DNA glimmered: patience, persistence, prayer. On the gallery's far wall, Noor hung a final piece, her own ultrasound image overlaid with calligraphy of 2:286. Beneath, she wrote in small type, "Even this burden was bearable because bearing includes letting go." Some wept, others simply nodded, understanding Sabr no longer as stoic statue but as reed flexible, humming when wind insists. After the exhibit, Daniel whisked her to Cornwall for 3 salt-clad days. They walked cliffs where Atlantic spray baptized intentions. On the last sunset they gathered pebbles, each naming one trial conquered: factory belt, fever, hip fracture, miscarriage, hate mail, insolvency, ignorance, bureaucracy. They tossed the stones off the cliff in synchronized arcs. As they fell, Noor recited the verse that began the story her father loved, the verse that had migrated through every chapter of their lives. "O you who believe, seek help through patience and prayer, surely God is with the steadfast." The pebbles plunked unseen into churning water, but somewhere beneath, the river-ocean continuum carried them forward, polishing edges with the simple, relentless liturgy of waves. Night folded over the sea. Stars ignited, punctuating the dark with promises measured in light years, testaments to patience on a cosmic scale. Noor traced Orion's belt, remembering her father's winter coat smelling of saffron, her mother's bowed thanks, Daniel's fevered whisper. She inhaled brine, exhaled syllables softer than wine, Sabr. The word hovered, merged with surf hiss, and became, for that moment, the entire audible universe. When they returned from Cornwall, the surf still hummed in Noor's ears as if the coastline had followed them back to Oxford on the coach's undercarriage. She felt rinsed, thinned, salt-polished, ready, she thought, for whatever season rehearsed backstage. Michaelmas term unfurled with meticulous Oxford punctuality, matriculation gowns rustled like black swans, library lamps glowed amber against early dusk, and the Bodleian's courtyard absorbed student laughter the way limestone drinks rain. Noor stepped into her seminar room and found the walls felt narrower, not from claustrophobia but acceleration. The fellowship's last 9 months would sprint. Daniel, meanwhile, had flown east again, this time to the Philippine island of Samar, where a typhoon had crowned every hill with twisted sheet metal halos. Funding was healthier since the viral video. Volunteers now wore shirts that read "Patience is solar-powered." Before boarding, he kissed Noor's knuckles and joked that airport security knew him by first name. She laughed, but as the boarding call echoed, she clutched his sleeve. "Quick reminder," she whispered, "the river refuses to rush." He nodded, understanding that Sabr could be shoveled into airplane cargo holds alongside hand tools and microinverters. Back in the flat, Noor opened her syllabus draft. The miscarriage had pruned certain ambitions. She could feel invisible scar tissue tightening whenever she planned, but it had also coaxed new shoots. She decided to design a capstone project titled Cartographies of Endurance, in which students would map a personal or historical ordeal onto a sacred text of their choosing, tracing routes from pain to possibility. She paired Viktor Frankl with the Prophet's Hijra, Wilma Rudolph's polio recovery with Ayyub's boils, and, at Daniel's suggestion, the Filipino Bayanihan spirit with the Quranic injunction to cooperate in righteousness. She read Surah 2:148. So compete in good deeds, and felt a glimmer, competition as collective uplift, not zero-sum. Mid-October static crackled through British politics. A bill christened the Integrity of Academia Act advanced in Parliament, proposing that any curricular material deriving authority from non-British sources be labelled and reviewed for national cohesion. Tabloids dubbed it the foreign faith filter. Noor recognized the columnist's fingerprints in its preamble. Universities protested, but polls sketched approval outside metropolitan bubbles. Campus chatter revolved around compliance pathways, risk matrices, and other euphemisms for self-censorship. One evening, the dean summoned fellowship recipients to discuss implications. He spoke kindly yet clinically. Courses overtly anchored in scripture would face scrutiny, grant renewals might shrink. Afterward, Noor cycled home along the canal, tires hissing over fallen plane tree leaves. She recalled verse 2:109, many of the people of the book wish they could turn you back to disbelief out of envy after truth has become clear. She wasn't facing envy exactly, but there was kinship in the pressure to retreat. At a lock gate she dismounted, stared at dark water wrapped in streetlight netting, and asked herself if patience meant compliance. The answer surfaced unbidden: Sabr sometimes stands, sometimes swims against. That weekend she drafted an open letter signed by interfaith educators across Europe, arguing that Britain's greatness had always been import-driven, spices, algebra, even parliamentary procedure scented with global influence. She quoted Surah 49:13, "We created you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another," and deployed Shakespeare's Cymbeline to prove the point in Elizabethan iambs. By Monday, 30 newspapers published the letter. By Tuesday, her inbox boiled, half praise, half threats. She filed the threats under a folder named Fertilizer. Layla had once said roses like rough soil. Daniel phoned from Samar on a connection full of monsoon static. "Roof install finished," he shouted. Kids staged a play about the sun beating the storm in extra time. She pictured his grin, wide enough to store clouds. Then his voice crackled lower. "Security flagged your letter on my passport profile." Pause. "Worth it." The call dropped. Noor stared at the dead screen until the notification light blinked. One new message from her mother. Layla's bakery stall, Karuki, had exploded on social media. A food blogger driving Route 22 tasted a mac in Cardamom Crescent, posted a reverent video, and orders mushroomed beyond the farmer's market. Layla wrote that she'd leased a small storefront painted pistachio green, opening next spring. God's mercy, the email concluded, bakes slowly but rises regardless. Noor's heart swelled with something that was equal parts pride and homesickness. She forwarded the message to Daniel, subject line, SS. Late November delivered 2 snowfalls and 1 scandal. A student group pasted posters around campus, warning this course contains foreign religious content. They singled out Noor's seminar, adding a QR code that linked to grainy footage of the street Pancras bombing aftermath, insinuating causality. University security peeled the posters, but digital copies multiplied. Noor's class attendance dipped, 2 students requested transfers, another came only to argue. During one session he slammed his notebook and declared, "If you want Sharia, go live where it's law." Noor inhaled, summoned the verse that begins, "O you who believe, be steadfast," and answered in a tone tempered in Layla's diner, "I live where my conscience is law, which happens to be here." The student left. The silence he abandoned felt scorched. That evening, while she reorganized lesson folders, news flashed of an arson attack on a mosque in Birmingham. No casualties, but walls charred, children's Qur'ans black-edged. She thought of Deshawn's scar, Layla's cane, Daniel's fever. They were chapters in an encyclopedia titled How Far Hate Will Walk If Unescorted. She rubbed her temples and prayed Istida, seeking refuge from the whispered malevolent. The next morning the fellowship board informed her that Home Office auditors would observe her Friday lecture. The auditors arrived wearing lanyards heavy with bureaucracy, sat in the back. Eyes shuddered. Noor kept her plan. The prophetic night journey paralleled with Martin Luther King's mountaintop speech. She spoke of spiritual elevation as social blueprint, displayed side-by-side images of the Dome of the Rock and the Memphis sanitation workers. When she finished, a student raised her hand. Is patience then an escalator or an elevator? Noor smiled, metaphor as aftercare, and answered, neither. It's a staircase that some can't see until someone else lights a candle. One auditor scribbled, the other stared. They left without questions. Saturday dawned translucent, frost-etching spiderwebs silver. Noor planned to spend it buried in revisions, but an email subject line detonated calm, final notice of compliance review. Her grant required immediate alignment with the pending Act's guidelines, including labeling every scriptural mention with non-domestic source. The bureaucratic absurdity, tagging the Qur'an like an imported mango, cracked something inside. She printed the directive, folded it into a paper airplane, and sailed it off the balcony. It looped once, crashed into a rosebush, and startled a cat that hissed as if reciting its own psalm. That afternoon Daniel returned, suitcase mud-splattered, shoulders sunburned. He carried a woven mat autographed by Samar children. For Professor Noor, they'd written, who teaches stars they can be maps. She hugged him long, inhaling rainforest humidity still trapped in his collar. He listened as she explained the compliance notice, her voice a seesaw of fury and fatigue. He fetched 2 mugs of ginger tea, placed one in her shaking hands, and said nothing until steam cleared his glasses. Then softly, remember verse 2:214, they were shaken until even the prophet asked, when is God's help? And the answer came, surely God's help is near. Noor closed her eyes, hearing her father's winter coat saffron, her mother's napkin confetti. Near is not later, near is a radius of resolve. They drafted a response, a 40-page counterproposal demonstrating how labeling texts would reduce nuance to taxonomy, how the act contradicted Britain's equality legislation, how students' reflections testified to the pedagogical necessity of sacred narratives. Daniel applied his engineering brain to data visualization, bar charts of empathy growth, pie charts of interfaith project collaborations. Noor wrote prose equal parts petition and sermon. They submitted it at dawn, emailing copies to allies, the Sikh sociologist, the Jewish poet, the classicist now a quiet convert to Karuki pastries. December snow canceled trains, Oxford fell muffled. Layla called, voice electric with storefront renovations, tile delays, frosting recipe tweaks, local news promising a feature called Faith and Flavor. She asked about the visa chaos rumored on television. Noor reassured her half-truth, half-prayer, then changed the subject to countertop colors. After hanging up, Noor laid the phone on her stomach, now flat again but no longer aching. She whispered Bismillah for the bakery, for Daniel's healing shoulders, for auditors still reading their brief. Christmas week the compliance office delivered verdict. Noor's course could continue unchanged for the current term, future approval contingent on Act's final wording. Bureaucratic limbo, but a stay of execution felt like sunrise. She forwarded the email to Daniel, subject line, HAR 2:214. He replied with a selfie from the Bodleian lawn, building a tiny snow minaret. On New Year's Eve they hosted a small gathering, interfaith colleagues, 2 nervy graduate students, and a neighbor who raised rescue greyhounds. Daniel cooked jollof rice adulterated with cumin. Noor read aloud Wendell Berry's poem, Manifesto, The Mad Farmer Liberation Front. At midnight fireworks erupted along the Thames. Someone passed a phone so they could watch Glassford celebrate by pearly lit livestream. In the pixelated crowd Noor spotted a pistachio-green awning, Karuki, letters glinting under string lights. Layla appeared, cane raised like a victorious general. Noor's tears surprised no one. Daniel wrapped her in a scarf still smelling of Philippine coconut sap, and the room hummed the universal anthem of Countdown's Reborn. Term resumed. The bill stalled in committee, some MPs balked at the administrative cost. Newspapers shifted frenzy to a royal biography. Trolls migrated to fresher meat. Noor's class list rebounded, including the student who had stormed out. He re-enrolled citing unfinished argument. She nodded, trusting debate as vitamin. February's rain battered Oxford like a drummer auditioning for apocalypse. Daniel's email pinged, Mozambique cyclone forecast severe, volunteers short. Noor watched him pack water filters yet again, felt impatience flicker. But she reminded herself of 2:286, no soul burden beyond capacity. Capacity, she concluded, could expand if watered by purpose. She prayed for his safe return and packed his suitcase with chocolate Karukis labeled Al-Sabr edition. Hours before his flight, a journalist requested an interview with Noor about the emotional toll of waiting. She almost declined, then agreed. Cameras set up in her office among student collages. The interviewer asked, "Do you ever wish your faith demanded less patience?" Noor considered the cracked plaster above the shelf, the hiding place where she kept her miscarriage test strip wrapped in verse, and answered, "Patience doesn't lower the weight, it strengthens the spine." Behind her, on the wall, a student's map project glowed, threads of gold embroidery connecting Mecca, Memphis, Samar, Glassford. It resembled neural synapses or constellations. That night, Oxford's sky cleared unexpectedly, revealing a scatter of stars rarely visible through city glare. Noor stepped onto the balcony, phone in hand, watching Daniel's plane track as a pixel across digital Atlantic. She remembered the pebbles they had thrown from Cornwall cliffs and wondered where the tide had carried them, perhaps ground smooth, resting now on some Breton beach beneath another couple's bare feet. She recited verse 2:153, the words leaving her lips as vapor that joined evening mist. In that chant she tasted cardamom, rust, antibiotics, chalk dust, sorrow, saffron, midnight ink. She tasted, too, the approaching promise of the fifth part of their story, still unwritten but already pulsing somewhere between oceans, between dawns, like a fetus of light preparing to be born from the womb of patience. High-altitude turbulence folded Daniel's flight toward Africa into slow motion, yet by the time he landed at Beira the cyclone had already rewritten geography into debris. Whole villages lay filleted, palm trunks flung like javelins, the only runway lights were halos from rescue trucks idling on cracked asphalt. He sent Noor a single text, arrived, safe, weak signal, heart steady, before reception dissolved into the night. She stared at the message in Oxford's pre-dawn dark, thumb hovering above a keyboard that had no button for relief mixed with undertow. Classes resumed, though every rain-lashed window became Mozambique in her peripheral vision. Students presented their cartographies of endurance. A Polish orphan mapped World War II displacement to Prophet Yusuf's imprisonment. A cancer survivor linked chemotherapy cycles to Mary's labor under the date palm in Surah Maryam. They spoke with voices braided from literature and revelation, and Noor thought, even if Parliament shackles curricula tomorrow, these stories have already breached the flood wall. Parliament, meanwhile, argued itself hoarse. Amendments gutted the integrity of Academia Act until it resembled a ship whose hull had been carved away plank by plank. Newspapers lost interest, the columnist pivoted to royal gossip. One Thursday afternoon, while Noor graded essays in the Ashmolean Café, a push alert blinked that the bill had died quietly in committee. Her pen froze mid-sentence. She closed her eyes, inhaled cinnamon rising from her latte, and whispered Alhamdulillah, catching the attention of a visiting tourist who smiled without understanding the word but recognizing gratitude's accent. Gratitude was the easier prayer, its counterpart, patience, still lay open, pages fluttering, as Mozambique's cyclone downgraded to a flood that refused to recede. Daniel's team erected provisional solar masts atop school ruins. Children clapped when light snapped on, thinking it magic. Then cholera surfaced. Volunteers siphoned contaminated water through makeshift filters, their hands raw from chlorine. Daniel slept in 3-hour increments, phone batteries rationed. His occasional messages arrived like Morse code across an ocean, lines long for clean water. Local imam opened mosque courtyard for triage. We quote your Sabr verse aloud every shift. Noor answered with voice memos reciting Surah 2:155-156 in Arabic then English, adding fragments of Billie Holiday and Mahmoud Darwish to remind him poetry, too, is an electrolyte. After sending each file, she touched her screen as if his pulse ran beneath the glass. At night she dreamed of him wading up the Thames toward their balcony, carrying sunlight in cupped palms that leaked gold through his fingers. One evening the center's director phoned. A British tabloid planned to accuse Daniel's non-profit of funneling aid to dubious religious entities. The accusation hinged on a screenshot showing volunteers praying before distributing supplies. Noor felt her lungs become locked suitcases. She drafted rebuttals, collected testimonies from UN officials, and sent a dossier to the paper's editor outlining the Quranic obligation to serve all in need, believer or not, citing verses 2:177 and 532. It may have worked or the scandal cycle simply spun elsewhere. The article was never printed. Still, Daniel texted, "Does truth need a PR firm?" Noor replied, "Only in a world that reads headlines faster than hearts." He reacted with the digital equivalent of laughter, a gif of a cat typing furiously. March thawed Oxford spires. Layla's pistachio green storefront opened under bunting stitched from retired diner aprons. Local news filmed her sprinkling rosewater over trays of karuki, cookies etched with delicate adas in saffron glaze. She wore her cane like royal regalia, explaining to the camera how patience tastes better when sweetened with nutmeg. On opening day she FaceTimed Noor, tilting the phone so customers could wave. Noor saw teenagers nibbling mac and crescents beside retirees reciting grace and felt the Atlantic contract. The distance expanded again 2 weeks later when Daniel's signal vanished altogether. Cyclone aftershocks breached a dam, severing power and cell towers. Relief logistic hubs couldn't confirm his sector's status. Noor scrolled satellite updates until her eyes blurred, reciting verse 2:214 under her breath so often it became background radiation. At dawn she found herself at the mosque, forehead against carpet fibers smelling of cardamom and feet, whispering, "O Lord, you said your help is near, let nearer be now." Day bled into day. She taught, smiled, moderated a panel on post-secular pedagogy, but every tick of the classroom clock sounded like a heartbeat too faint to detect. On the fourth night of silence, she opened her father's Qur'an finally, the one whose margins bore his penciled chemist's scribbles relating patience to molecular stability. A small envelope fell out, her miscarriage test strip unintentionally tucked here months ago. She stared at the faint double line, the almost child, and suddenly heard her father's voice. Atoms survive by sharing electrons, hearts survive by sharing trials. She pressed the strip back between verses 153 and 154 and felt a tremor of acceptance ripple outward like concentric rings. At sunrise her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. A Mozambican nurse spoke English flavored by Portuguese vowels. Daniel Price was safe, mild dysentery, receiving 4 fluids, insisted Noor be told he still owed her a Cornwall Sunset sequel. Noor exhaled so sharply she startled the pigeons on her sill. Tears tasted of sea salt and antiseptic fear. She thanked the nurse, then prostrated one more time, the sajda heavier with gratitude than any she remembered. University term concluded with an exhibition of student maps pinned onto a wall-length canvas. Parents wandered between stories stitched across continents, paused at a braille overlay describing Noor's miscarriage map titled, Unborn, Not Unloved. One mother touched the raised dots and whispered, "This is blessing through scar." The phrase lodged in Noor's ribs like a meteorite that neither burned nor cooled. Summer emptied dormitories. Noor flew to Beira on a relief charter, seatbelts still sticky with duct tape repairs. The plane banked over patchwork lagoons that used to be neighborhoods. On landing she inhaled air spiced with diesel and wet earth. Daniel waited under a tattered UNICEF tarp, face leaner, beard sprinkled with fatigue, for port capped at his wrist. They reached each other without words, their embrace pressed 2 heartbeats into one tempo. Around them, a generator coughed to life, floodlights blinked on, and a boy balancing a jerry-can shouted, "Lose light." They spent 2 weeks sleeping on mats, rationing potable water, cataloging supply gaps. Noor read bedtime stories to displaced children, first in English, then paraphrased into the Portuguese nouns she'd practiced on the flight. Occasionally she slipped in Quranic parables, the people of the cave dreaming centuries, Mary shaking the date palm during contractions. The children listened wide-eyed, hardship they sensed was a multilingual narrator. On Noor's last Mozambique evening, the local imam invited them to iftar. Ramadan had begun under broken roofs. The call to prayer rose from a megaphone powered by Daniel's solar mast. They sat on palm-woven mats, breaking fast with cassava soup and dates donated by a Jordanian NGO. The imam recited Surah 2:157, blessings and mercy upon the patient, then added a supplication for those who travel oceans to remind us the ocean inside us is patience itself. Noor felt the verse settle over the camp like mosquito netting, protective and porous enough for starlight. Back in Oxford the trustees surprised her. Despite the Act's demise, the fellowship would evolve into a permanent lectureship titled Endurance Studies, with Noor as inaugural professor. The appointment arrived with modest funding to digitize her cartographies project globally. She drafted a plan, interactive maps where users could pin trials and favorite verses, building a constellation of communal Sabr. Daniel teased that she'd invented a spiritual GPS. Autumn painted the Isis with migrating geese arrows. Daniel's nonprofit merged with a larger climate action network, freeing him from perpetual field deployments. They found a cottage outside town, windowsill wide enough for tulips and maybe, inshallah, crib mobiles someday. A conception they decided would not be a finish line, it would be another path among many. Patience, they learned, is not waiting for one door but walking the corridor. Layla visited during reading week, navigating Heathrow in a wheelchair only for airport efficiency, she insisted. She unpacked tins of karukis, each sealed with washi tape printed with verse 2:286. When Noor's colleagues tasted the cookies they asked for a supply contract. Layla winked and declared she might franchise before Parliament could regulate pastries as foreign influence. One fog-draped evening she joined them at Maghrib prayer in the cottage living room. Daniel called the adhan in a timbre grown deeper. Noor led the supplication afterward, thanking God for journeys that bend but do not break. Layla lifted her palms and added a duet, "O Sustainer, teach us to season patience with joy." Snow returned, quiet as chalk dust. On the year's final lecture day, Noor ended class not with her words but with Wiklet, a shy Malaysian student reciting Surah 2:153 from memory, her vowels lilting. The verse filled the room like warm rain after wildfire. Students instinctively placed their hands over hearts, atheist, Hindu, lapsed Anglican alike, forming an uncoordinated pledge. The moment stretched, unframed, then dissolved into the scrape of chairs. That night Noor and Daniel walked to the river. Stars hid behind cloud gauze, yet the water reflected street lamps in trembling mosaics. They stood where bankside reeds whistled old jazz. Noor produced 2 stones from her coat pocket, a Cornwall souvenir and a Barra River rock, to throw as updated testimonies. Daniel counted to 3. The stones arced, intersected midair, and vanished with twin plunks. Ripples expanded, collided, calmed. Noor whispered, "We've tested verse to breaking point." Daniel answered, "And the verse tested us to healing point." She leaned into him, the chill sharpening her gratitude, and finished the line her father had drilled decades ago, "Surely God is with the steadfast." The words did not echo, the river absorbed them the way parchment absorbs ink, pulling meaning downward where current keeps stories soft but unerasable. A breeze carried the scent of distant pastries and wet tulips. Somewhere across the Atlantic, cicadas prepared for summer, floodwaters receded, bakery ovens cooled, and a Qur'an on a Pennsylvania windowsill fluttered to Surah 2 as if reminded of its queue of lives yet to steady. Noor closed her eyes, hearing in the rustling pages the same promise that had threaded their years: patience is not the art of standing still but the discipline of moving at the speed of trust. She opened her eyes to Daniel's profile gilded by riverside lamplight and felt hope, not the naive kind that denies storms, but the mature kind that outlasts them, lift in her chest like a sail catching deliberate wind. Together they began walking home, borrowing the river's refusal to rush, each step a quiet recitation of gratitude in the original language of endurance.